Welcome to the latest episode of Sustainability Talks. I'm your host, Zoe VanderWolk, partner and head of sustainability and investor relations at ETF Partners, Europe's foremost venture capital firm committed to advancing sustainability through innovation. In today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome the esteemed Azeem Azhar, a highly respected strategist, investor, and serial entrepreneur. With his rich professional background, Azeem has established a deep understanding of the crossroads between technology, business, and society. Leveraging his insights, we will delve into the intricate dynamics shaping the future of sustainability in startups and VC. We'll explore thought-provoking topics such as how ESG factors are influencing investment decisions and the potential of technology as a catalyst for sustainable innovation. We'll also discuss the challenges and opportunities that startups face while embedding sustainability into their business models. This conversation promises to offer a unique perspective on the evolving landscape of sustainable VC. We'll also explore the challenges and opportunities presented by the transition to a low-carbon economy. This episode promises to be an enlightening discussion for anyone interested in the future of sustainability and our transition to a net zero economy, and critically, the vital role that startups play in driving towards a more sustainable future. Tune into Sustainability Talks for a unique and thoughtful exploration of these important topics. So coming on to our guest today, Azeem, tell us more about your background and your work across technology, sustainability, and investment. I'm particularly interested in when sustainability first really, came onto your horizon in your world.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Zoe. It's great to be speaking to you. I've been, involved in technology since I was very young. I still have my first computer, which I got in 1981, before I turned 9, and it's sitting behind me at my desk. And so, sitting with the computer industry has been very, very much part of my growing up, and I'm now just turned 51. Maybe when I'm an adult and fully mature, it'll still be part of my my life. And you can see from that moment, that age, I started to get into the world of work around the time the internet was already becoming quite popular, so 1994, 95. And so it was natural to take those interests into working into the internet sphere. And I think if you go back then, sustainability meant lots of different things, right? It sort of meant a bit of recycling. It meant the ozone hole, which was sort of underway with being sort of repaired at that time. It meant things like acid rain. It may have even meant overpopulation. It didn't necessarily mean climate change at that point. And actually, the discussion around oil was much more about peak oil rather than peak carbon dioxide, which is what we now worry about. And I think my first, beyond the sort of breakthrough work that started to happen with Hansen and so on after the late 90s, introduction to some of these ideas as a transformative force was through a guy called Michael Liebreich, who founded a company called New Energy Finance. And I was lucky enough to be one of the angel investors in that business. And New Energy Finance was later acquired by Bloomberg. And it is probably the best single source for mapping out the investment flows into the post-carbon energy system, which is now much broader than when Michael started that business some more than a decade ago, because it includes decarbonizing transport and freight, and looks at things like heat pumps, not just this question of how do you produce useful energy for the economy. And so that was my first real introduction to the field that was making me think a little bit about this. And then when I was working alongside a VC firm in London, I started to think quite a lot about this idea of climate tech. This is back in about 2016, 2017. And having been very, very well apprised of the first clean tech bubble, when venture capitalists were funding bioethanol factories, and you had businesses like A Better Place, which was, I think, going to do EV charging more than 15 years ago, and there seemed to be a current that came back round to look at this. And I think it came back round largely because of the factors that we really understand, which was that Greta Thunberg constructed this incredible spark that started to create both a consumer pull and a policy pull towards this issue. And of course, once you have markets that are pulling, that becomes interesting for investors. And at the same time, I think there were some really interesting milestones in certain technologies. So in particular, lithium ion batteries were 7 or 8 years into this kind of double digit price decline. And solar panels had really, really come down in price back from, the early 1970s, when you only put them on military satellites, to actually being kind of useful in people's homes, and we get to that crossover point. So then I get quite interested in the climate VC space, and with the then head of sustainability at PwC, we launched a global climate tech report back in, I think it was 2021. It all blurs because of COVID, where we looked at every climate tech deal that had been done over the previous decade or so, and tried to figure out who the investors were, what the sectors were, what was underrepresented, what was overrepresented, how venture capital funding into that sector, which didn't have a track record the way, say, software venture capital does, how that might evolve, and what the values of death and so on were. So that really gave me some interesting positioning and a little bit of an early understanding of the space.
Well, that's fascinating. So you first encountered it in the context of BNEF with finance, then through sort of infrastructure, EV charging and things. And then finally, as you're saying, with PwC, sort of the role of technology. That sort of arc is fascinating because sustainability is also so sort of natural, right? It's something we can touch, and yet the way that my encounter with sustainability was very similar to yours as well. Of course, then technology is now where we're at, sort of with sustainability, and it seems that technology is the least material, of things, and sustainability and nature is sort of the most material. How do you see the role of technology, therefore, evolving in the context of sustainability? We're not really just talking about kind of infrastructure anymore.
Yeah, I think that the root of the issue, and actually my first introduction with sustainability, and it's so useful that we're having this conversation, was actually when I was much younger. It was was talking about Thomas Malthus with my mum, who had done an economics degree like many, many decades earlier. And, Malthus was obviously worried about what people would then start to call the carrying capacity of a country, based on the exponential growth of the population, but the geometric growth in our ability to make sense of that. And then, of course, studying economics, I was introduced to this idea, which I think really sits at the root of some of the issues, which is the idea of the externality, right? So the unpriced cost. And, I think a lot of where we have ended up has been as a consequence of both of those dynamics. So the first dynamic is that the exponential capacity of the human economy to do stuff. When you started cutting down the first sequoia trees in the mid-19th century, as Westerners started to settle in what is now Oregon and California, there were just so many of them, one could hardly imagine that you would cut them all down. But of course, knowledge compounds, economic capabilities increase, technology gives you more power. And so we actually grow into this ability to be bigger than and more demanding than nature could possibly have fathomed in its process of evolution. But the second aspect really is the question of externalities, which really connects to the ESG theme, and the sense that starting with the very, very early formal economic analysis, but actually that analysis was based on observing practice, businesses were concerned with efficiency, not their presence within an ecosystem because of other systems, whether they were natural or other firms or the community in which they lived, because those things are too hard to theorize, frankly, in a simple model, which is what economists really, really love. And so you end up on a long, long intellectual trajectory where by the late 1960s, we are presented with this idea that the purpose of the firm is just to operate for profits within the rules. Which gives real clarity to the managers, but it also disavows any sense of the mess that is being created. And I think that part of the challenge was that in the 1970s, that mission was taken forward, even though at the same time you had not so much the rise, but the renaissance of of modern environmental movements and the work of people like Eleanor Ostrom in terms of stewardship and of ecosystems. Those are contemporary ideas to the ideas of Milton Friedman, but they didn't really get a look in during that period of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And so the externality, as we got better and better at what we were doing, really went unaddressed, and we were so focused on this question of prosperity with efficiency, that we sort of end up where we end up today.
It's amazing, actually, when you think about it, because you know when I think about people like my grandfather's era, he used to say that he was conservative and you couldn't spell conservatism without conservation. And he
Right.
was a businessman and he was very focused on his community and these kinds of things. And at some point that sense of community obligation almost got divorced from the idea of progress.
Can I say something about that? Because that's
Yeah.
so interesting. And I remember when the earliest web commerce services started to emerge, and I'm not really thinking about
Yeah.
Amazon at this point, but I remember there was a steaks company in Texas which was going to post its steaks, mail its steaks off its website back in the like 95, 96 period of time, with this idea that you could reach a community of like-minded people
Uh-huh.
with your products. And there was something that was really promising about that. But actually, of course, what ends up happening is that it ends up being a marketplace that is systematized through drop shipping
Mhm.
and marketing funnel optimization, and the seller does not look at the community value of the people buying their products. Oh, it's Zoe coming back to buy that candle again. Oh, Azeem's
Yeah.
gone from candles to oils now.
Yeah.
They're simply looking at the score on their Shopify, the score being, are my sales going up?
Yeah.
And that process where you could go off and look at your grandfather's business and say, well, actually now this is a way for local artisanal businesses to kind of reconnect communities through a process of space compression, right? Effectively
Mm.
teleporting across the internet. That moment lasted a brief flicker of half an instant before
Yeah.
it got replaced by Etsy and Shane and Temu and all these things, which are absolutely as far away from the community driven business as you could possibly imagine.
They're as depersonalized, in the sense that you never have to look your customer in the eye, right?
Right.
That's
Absolutely.
fascinating. I mean, I suppose that kind of comes into the societal struggles, that I know you've written a lot about. I'm sorry, I'm skipping slightly around the questions here, but
No, no,
it
it's no
seems like
problem.
a natural continuation. You talk a lot about society and how society can keep pace with technological change. Is that something that businesses can do, or do we have to, deal with that on a sort of political level? How do individual kind of startups, businesses keep that sense of externalities that they're creating, or is this something that we have to deal with through politics, as it were?
Well, politics responds to signals as well,
Mhm.
and so the extent to which businesses show that they care will also help drive the decisions of politicians, and I think that was the real power of Greta Thunberg. But that said, I think it's really hard to make it incumbent on a single business that is competing to, especially if you're a small business, to adhere to sustainability standards that are much more stringent than those of your competitors, because then you won't be a small business for long. You'll be a very small business, and then you won't be a business at all.
Yeah.
And so, to some extent, you need policy. But I think that there's another thing that is going on, which is, and this is a reason for optimism, and that is that physics does not negotiate, right? For the laws of physics are the laws of physics, and when the laws of physics find their way into our financial system, you can start to see quite interesting outcomes. And I think one really fascinating phenomenon, and I'm not sure how true it is since all the rate rises of the last year, but it was certainly true before then, was that if you looked at the cost of capital for particular types of energy investment, the kind of market cost of capital for solar farms or wind farms was
Mhm.
400 to 500 basis points lower than if you wanted to get money from the bond markets to build a coal-fired power station. And the reason was that the market had essentially said, given what the policy world looks like, this coal-fired power station doesn't have a 30-year life, it's got a 10-year life. So I need to be paid much more. And that's happening regardless of whether, Biden or Trump are in the White House, right? That is the market speaking, and it's processing the scientific understanding that we have. And the same thing, of course, happens with respect to insurance rates, and particularly kind of catastrophe insurance rates, and the extent to which they impact the viability of new infrastructure projects. So I think what's quite interesting there is that not only was, for every kind of intermittent megawatt delivered, solar getting cheaper and cheaper because of technological learning, but the market had recognized the short lifespan for new coal plants and made them much more expensive to finance. And I think we shouldn't understate those types of interactions and processes, and bear in mind that the market is this information processing mechanism. And I think something similar is happening with the EV transition right now.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating that you mentioned that, because obviously we've just seen a big policy change announcement here in the UK about, net zero no longer being, a particular time frame. I was interested, what do you think you're seeing? Are people reacting to that, or is the market baking in these kinds of assumptions regardless of what politicians are doing?
I think that that was red meat to the crowd, or it was Parnamensa Kensis. The Tory party has got kind of real challenges about its political support. It doesn't have much of a base in the under 45s, not much of one between the 45s and 64s, and it's really so it's finding divisive measures and words like the war on motorists, and the thing in my head is that, of course, it may have some kind of a delaying effect. It may be a bit of a headwind, but I would say that I don't think it will. And the reason it won't is because of some of those interactions that are happening in the, in the market between consumer choice, fleet buying choice for vehicles, and how car manufacturers are responding. So essentially, when you look at adoption curves for products, once you're past about 15%, you'll get to about 75% within 5 to 6 years. And the UK is there, and it's on track essentially to get to, I think, 50% of all new cars sold being electric vehicles, battery electric or plug-in hybrid, within a sort of 2-year period, or for 1 month, not for the whole calendar year, from about 29% today. And you have to understand what's going on in there, right? So what's going on in there is that as a consumer, I am seeing all of my friends buy these electric vehicles, or more and more of them. And so there's often a tipping point where kind of a threshold in these viral dynamics that gets reached. Something looks like tomorrow and something looks like yesterday. And there's a moment where people are holdouts to their Nokia phones rather than the iPhone. But there's another moment, there's a large group of people who just say, well, I want to buy tomorrow because I'm going to live in tomorrow. So you've got to overcome that kind of momentum if you want to stop the sales of electric vehicles, the way the Conservative Party has sort of indicated it wants to slow that down. But there's something else that's going on, which is that manufacturers are having to support two platforms. And manufacturers are going to have to decide. I mean, this is no secret, by the way. In any large company, some employees are highly motivated and excellent, and some employees are not excellent and not highly motivated. And the question is, when you look at your teams, where are your best people going to want to work? Are they going to want to work in the future or in the past? And increasingly, people will shift internally towards wanting to work on the next rather than the last, especially as it's now completely clear the electric transition is taking place. So effectively what will happen, Zoe, is that EVs coming out from manufacturers who are making both will be better quality. They'll be sold more. They'll end up being more profitable. it will mean that the financial decisions, investment decisions within those firms will shift resources towards the EV platforms, and it will make the petrol vehicles and the diesel vehicles static, under-improved, and progressively more expensive as they sell
Yeah.
fewer and fewer of them. And those little tipping points will be visible. And I think it's very, very hard at this point to stop that trajectory. And I'm really not sure that this shift back to 2035, I mean, it's like a reverse IEA. You know, the IEA always misforecasts solar and has done for 25 years, and even their new forecasts do it. And it didn't really, it had this negative effect because it made people think the market was not growing as quickly as it could. But I just don't think this will make any difference. BYD is not going to make petrol cars. They are going to flood the European market with amazing mid-price, Chinese-made electric vehicles. And there will be some people who will say, I want to buy a petrol car because it is more expensive, worse to drive, using older technology, less safe and less comfortable than an electric vehicle. But that's my choice. And I mean, fine, but there are not going to be that many of them.
That's true. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, less fun to drive. Sometimes I feel like the aesthetic of, people are like, oh, I'm not sure about electric vehicles. And they go and drive one and they realize they can go, 0 to 60 in, a few seconds. They're like, I think I'll have one of these.
4.2 in the case of my SUV, which is hilarious. And the thing I would say is that what you don't get in most electric vehicles that people can afford to buy, and I'm not thinking about the super top end, is you don't get the driver's driver experience. But most drivers don't drive like that, and they don't get that experience from nearly all of their driving. They may think they do, but they actually don't. And yesterday I had to go and do a really long drive by UK standards, so it was 5 hours round trip in the driving rain up a motorway, and I was really glad that I was in a modern electric vehicle with loads of cameras that helped me know where the cars around me were, even when I couldn't see, with a really, really smooth, consistent power delivery to the vehicle. So I knew exactly what my foot was going to do, with fantastic cruise control that stopped me getting too tired. And once you've done that, I mean, to hell with whether you can corner rapidly at Le Mans. I mean, I never drive that race circuit.
Yeah. No, I drive a Hyundai Kona, which is definitely not, anything fancy. And it's just unbelievably comfortable compared to any other car. And even my parents, who are always dubious, are always like, can you come and pick us up in the electric?
Right.
So when things are more comfortable, then people switch. Do you think that applies to other technologies as well in sustainability? We have to make it a sort of aesthetic choice for, I want to be in the cool new futuristic thing, but also this is comfortable and easy.
I think the law of lowest price is the bit that makes the difference. In my case, the car I bought was cheaper than the equivalent petrol car I would have bought by some substantial amount, by more than 20%. And I think that once people start to figure out what their costs are, I mean, I live in a part of London where the average road speed is about 7.5 miles an hour, and so we've had an i3 for a long time, which is a really small vehicle, and the cost is not the dollar cost, and we don't drive very many miles, so we don't really save that much on petrol, although it's hundreds of pounds a year. The fact is, it's a really small car that can nip through things, and it can accelerate quickly, which is exactly what you need. And it's much, much more pleasant to be in stop-go traffic in an electric vehicle than in a petrol vehicle. And if you're driving large amounts of miles, you're going to save so much money in an electric vehicle. And anyway, so I think that the cost is the thing that really, really matters. So my friend Vinod Khosla, who's a VC who's done a lot of climate tech based out of the US, came up with this phrase about 15 years ago called the Chindia price. And he essentially said, it's got to be cheap enough so that China and India are willing to buy it unsubsidized, and then you've won. And how you get it that cheap is really about, I think in my book, it's sort of technological learning, and then it's economies of scale. And the beauty of that is that you're not asking anyone to pay a green premium. So one
Mhm.
of the things I disagreed with Gates in his book was he kept going on about the green premium, the green premium. But the thing is, the green premium disappears because we are actually building with better technologies. And when you build with better technologies, you will find prices coming down very, very, very rapidly. And so I think that that is the thing that we need to pay attention to, because it works for the consumer or the business in fair weather or foul.
That makes sense. And where do you think AI fits into this then? I mean, you often discuss the potential of AI, the dangers of AI, the potential. I mean, we've seen just today, the European Union saying that, perhaps we shouldn't, have a knee-jerk regulation of AI until we figured out, what the benefits are. I mean, do you think AI can play a role in achieving these kinds of sustainability goals, or is that just a tool to get us to where we want to go, but actually it's going to come down to cost and things like that?
Well, I think we should step back and think about what AI is and what drives costs down. So we have got dumb ways and smart ways of doing things. I'll just give you two examples. Um, so I'm sitting in my garden office right now, looking out into the garden, and there are all these plants out there, and they are doing something really wonderful and elegant, which is they are fixing nitrogen. And they're doing it beautifully and elegantly, and they're applying a lot of intelligence. It's biological intelligence. It's the information processing that is embedded in the eons of training that's gone through biological evolution, and they fix nitrogen in a really, really intelligent way, and they do it across a really effective energy gradient through various mechanisms. And somewhere in England, the UK, I'm not sure where, but there is going to be a massive factory that is heating up to several hundred degrees centigrade and compressing at hundreds of atmospheres of pressure over an iron catalyst to smash atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen, probably secured through steam reforming or something like that, in the Haber Bosch process. And tons of energy is used. And it's a really, really dumb process. It's like, this is how the Incredible Hulk would do nitrogen fixation. Um, and because we don't put much information or intelligence into that process, we have to brute force it. And it's 2% of carbon emissions. So what we know is that there's this kind of fungibility between energy on the one hand and intelligence on the other. The more you can bring intelligence to bear to a problem, you can do it with more elegance, like the beautiful plants in my garden. And so when we come to AI, the way I think about this is we're vastly increasing the supply of some form of intelligence. So that, there are many, it's a disputed term, but we can agree that there is some form of intelligence in the spectrum, in the same way that plants exhibit it, in this that AI will bring to bear. And so the question is, what happens when you dramatically expand your access to kind of limited cognitive processing across an economy? And what does that allow you to do? Does that allow you to do fewer Haber Bosches and more plant-based systems? I mean, as an analogy, right? In other words, can we look at processes that are incredibly inefficient and wasteful right now and start to make them better? Can we get to that chindia price more quickly because we have a particular process that is highly sustainable and circular, and a sort of low impact in terms of all of its different types of pollutions, but a little bit expensive? But through the application of this novel intelligence and processing, speed down that learning curve more rapidly. So that's how I think about AI's role in any of this, really, which is, we've got lots of smart or dumb people, however you want to think about it, but kind of this new additional cognitive processing and information processing that can help us push our frontier of knowledge and figure out how to do things more efficiently, more precisely, and less energetically.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's interesting because we all know through history, that there have always been, every so often a sort of incredible mind that comes along that just seems to be able to, everything it touches, it seems to be able to move things forward. I'm thinking of people like John von Neumann, who is, on lots of different levels, artistic, philosophical, scientific, was able to come up with ways to move things forward. Is AI basically that great mind, but then put in everyone's pocket and in everyone's computer?
I would say that it's more right now. The best analogy I could make is it's like having lots and lots of quite good but slightly flaky graduate students working with you. But you can do a lot with 1 million graduate students. Honestly,
Yeah.
I mean, you may never be able to come up with game theory, but there's a lot else
Yeah.
you can do. But there are other things that you can start to do with today's AI systems, like you can run things in silico rather than in vivo. So it's really, really expensive to run nuclear fusion experiments when you're trying to optimize the shape of the fuel pellet. And each fuel pellet takes 6 to 8 weeks to machine at great cost. And then you run the experiment and it turns out, yeah, you need a better shape,
Yeah.
right? So instead you can run 100 billion simulations, and you optimize in silico, and then you machine it in real life, and you see whether you can actually machine to the quality that the simulations have achieved. So those are the types of things I think that help us tackle these sorts of questions, or even as we think about how we improve the fundamental materials that are needed for deep decarbonization, right? Whether it is more efficient and cheaper substrates on which we can build photovoltaic cells, or whether it's superconductors for electrical conduction and transmission, or for magnets. We can use these tools to digitally assist us in the discovery of those systems. And we're at the early stages of this AI wave, but we're already seeing things happen in material science, specifically around magnets, that have been enabled quite often by quite surprising but easy to access AI systems.
Well, it's really exciting. My mind is sort of boggling to think, how many different applications there could be. But I do find that I can always spot certainly large language models, because they always talk like a slightly pompous graduate student. So
Yes,
maybe
yeah,
that's
they
it.
are a bit like that. But we should also be clear, right, that incentives matter an enormous amount, and so does the systemic framework. And the incentives issue is really one about what is this technology really being used for,
Yeah.
and to what extent is it actually being used to tackle sustainability questions, right? This is
Yeah.
and so this is the old rebound effect, or the Jevons paradox side of the problem, right? If we use these technologies to make us all desire more fast fashion, and make
Yeah.
that fast fashion even more disposable, and less circular, well, we're heading in the wrong direction. We need to think about those types of issues as well, and those end up being questions that are a little bit more systemic.
So it's interesting because I stalked you a little bit, obviously, on LinkedIn before this interview, and I saw that you did sort of it looked like you probably did similar A levels to me, sort of maths, further maths, physics, chemistry, those kinds of things, and then went and studied PPE. I was wondering if you think that that really helped you with a sense of both the sort of technological background, but also, in scientific training, but also then a sense of ethics, proportional, sort of the way that, in a historical, perspective. Do you think that helps you think through these kinds of things? Because one of the things that I've really found is a lot of people who have a purely technical training, they don't really think about the way that whatever problem that they're solving is, the externalities, the way that it can be applied to sustainability, the way that it will be used. It's kind of like, oh, that's not my role. I just solve this technological problem. And the way that it's used and the way that it interacts with the world is kind of someone else's problem. Do you think that we need to have more of more thought around the sort of purposes of these kinds of things, as well as just, solve this technological problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we do need that. I think it's also okay for people to go off and say, you know what, I'm really, 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 really just a specialist in the mechanisms of the kinase protein circuit, like in
Yeah.
biological systems. Yeah, that's all I know, and that's the only way in which we'll ever make progress against this, of which we don't even know what the word progress means. I think it's fine to have super specialists. I think the issue that we have, we've run into a little bit has been that, CP Snow talked about it, the two cultures, that there needs to be a stronger and better interface that exists. In other words, people who are able to speak both languages or all the languages, the polyglots, are really, really important. And when I started writing the book, I started to think that a lot of this related to the culture of business in general, and the technology industry in particular, to absolutely undervalue all of this,
Yes.
and also
Yeah.
the idea that the process of thinking from first principles is a deeply ahistorical way of looking at the problem, but it's embedded in the culture of innovation. Right? Okay, guys, let's start on a white page. Let's just assume there are no constraints. Right? That's the process that you go through when you're building some kind of tech startup or tech product, and that may be helpful in coming up with some new widget of software or hardware, but it is deeply ahistorical. So when I started to think, well, this is where the issue lies. But as I got further into it, the work and my research, I started to realize that it's as much about people on who are not involved in the tech industry, their ability to understand not the technologies, because understanding technology is not to understand the configuration file in Microsoft Word, right? Or to know how to get it to print page numbers on both sides of the document. Understanding the technology industry is to both understand von Neumann and Shannon and information theory, and to understand how software emerges, but it's also to understand the discipline and the process of science and the trade-offs that get made off there. It's to understand the foundational ideas like the second law of thermodynamics, or networks and circuits, which find themselves showing up in information technology, biology, and everywhere else. And also, really, really important to understand how those things then roll up in their sociological presentation. So, for example, rich get richer phenomenon, right, and power law phenomenon that we see emerging through all sorts of in all sorts of kind of technology infused markets, and to ask why that's the case. So I think that the problem that you've identified is it's a space that I've tried in my work to fill and to bring people in and to kind of tool both sides up as best I can, because it isn't sitting with one group or another, and many of the issues that we deal with in the technology industry today, for example, the large tech companies effectively determining what we can and can't do with our devices. These are things that philosophers and jurists had been talking about for decades. Before then, in fact, you could go back all the way to Foucault and Weber and Bentham to identify those ideas emerging. Right. So I think that partly it's about where should this space of conversation happen, and then it gets connected to incentives, right? Because any Silicon Valley startup who spends time thinking about Bentham rather than just closing their sales pipeline is going to get overtaken by the one that focuses on sales.
So we started with this conversation talking about Malthus. I mean, I once was a bit naughty on a panel, and I said, I don't think anything that, prolongs the longevity of human beings can count as, E for ESG, because the more people who are living on the planet, there's more use of resources. And so who should be thinking about these kinds of things? I guess, is it if it's not the startup because they're thinking about how to make their numbers and get their investors a return and sell their product, whose role is it?
Well, I mean, I actually think that it's all of our roles.
Mhm.
It's all of our roles to engage in these
Yeah.
discussions, that we have been encouraged to care about really, really narrow questions, because that conformity is easier to manage for political powers that be,
Mhm.
and rather than it be something that gets pushed elsewhere for consideration. I mean, the part, I think part of the issue that we've got to, just to quote from Homer, the nuclear power plant worker from Springfield, Massachusetts, when
I was
he
going to be, this is a
runs,
very erudite conversation.
well, when he runs for sanitation commissioner,
Uh-huh.
he runs under the slogan, which is incredibly appealing: "Let someone else do it." So under Homer, you don't have to leave your trash out. You don't have to put anything into the right bag. Someone else is going to do it.
Yeah.
And let someone else do it has been, I think, a really large part of the mantra of the effectiveness of capitalism to deliver, first the kind of basics of hygiene and housing and so on, and then this idea of prosperity, and that machine just works, and people
Yeah.
are on average more prosperous in most parts of the world than our forebears were 100 years earlier. And we do it without really asking that too many hard questions, and those people who do ask hard questions get labeled in particular ways. So I think that we have a kind of an opportunity at the moment to re-engage people in these types of decisions and discussions and give them that agency. When my book came out a couple of years ago, I did a book tour, and I went to lots of places to speak, and I was consistently impressed by the depth of thinking that I was getting in places around the UK where you wouldn't have necessarily said, "Oh yeah, this is a place where people really think deeply about technology." And there
Yeah.
are some little examples of this showing up where you're getting this citizen participation. So
Mm.
Macron just ran something called a citizens jury to look at a very difficult issue, which was right to life. And a citizens jury meant that it wasn't the politicians who made the decision. A couple of hundred selected jurors from the population discussed and disputed this with experts over several weeks and came out with recommendations. The city of Brussels has a permanent citizens jury to look at issues around the city and sustainability. And this is not a focus group, it is a deliberative jury. And you start to see these mechanisms being used. Of course, being as they are, the Canadians and the New Zealanders have been doing this in local communities for a long time, and but you see these mechanisms being used, and they partially address the challenge you raised to me: is who should be thinking about this? Because I think that
Mm.
when people are given the opportunity, the space, the agency, and also that sense of the privilege that they're representing their peers to do this, they really step up.
It's fascinating. We're sort of coming full circle to some of these like ancient wisdoms, right? We have common law system that assumes that, lay people from the street are actually, once they're kind of given the information, they're able to make a sensible, informed decision and think deeply about these kinds of things in a jury trial, for instance. So, we have a similar, sort of coming back around to these kinds of processes that seem very basic and built into our culture, but do seem to still have value. I think that also applies to things like circularity, right? And we're now investing. We've invested in a company that it eliminates single-use plastics, and it's going back to glass bottles, right? Or sort of reusable packaging, local buying, 15-minute cities, these kinds of old models that still seem to now have more of an implication for sustainable living, perhaps augmented by AI or enabled by data or by technology in some way.
Yeah, well, I think the value of so that's extremely powerful, and it's really, really exciting because I think that is how people that I don't think you have to push very hard to get
Yeah,
people to care about their communities and their local environments. And the fascinating thing about the internet is that that's exactly what the internet is. So the internet was individual computer network administrators in this university, that university, and t'other university in the late 80s, early 90s, caring about their networks and then agreeing to connect to this common pool. And that's what the internet is. It's an internetwork.
yeah,
And you did that from the bottom up. And now people think of the internet as this top-down thing, but that's not what it is.
yeah,
And so what's interesting is that we have a global example where those sort of bottom-up issues concerns can be turned into something that is big and global and beautiful. What we have to get comfortable with is that it is a bit chaotic, and you have to sit and hear people who maybe don't talk like you or care about different things to you. And I wonder the extent to which neighborhood WhatsApp groups are sort of a reflection of some of those issues. You wouldn't say, let's figure out our policy towards COVID vaccines through the neighborhood WhatsApp group, right? It's a wrong
yeah,
mechanism for it. But it's not the wrong mechanism for someone to say, hey, I'm thinking about getting a recycling truck around next week and it's going to cost me 100 quid. Does anybody else want to just chuck in 20 quid? So, and I'll get it to stop at your place too. Right. I mean, that is a mechanism that is a kind of community driven local mechanism that's enabled by a technology like this. And the role of AI in all of this is that it should create space for us to do that in the way that the electric light created space for us, because we then got 6 hours of the day to do more stuff
yeah.
in it. And you would hope that another productivity enhancing technology could do something similar.
It's interesting. I actually grew up in Asia, and I've often thought about the air conditioner. The air
Right.
conditioner, I think, has been transformative in a lot of areas where, traditionally people would have a long sleep in the middle of the day, or, it was just kind of too hot to do a lot of stuff. And I've often thought that actually the air conditioner is very underrated in its transformative aspect of productivity in a lot of regions, like, where I grew up, for instance.
Right. Yeah, no, it is. It is because you can suddenly do things. You can make use of the time that would otherwise be lost.
Yeah.
But again, the question is whether you're able to, and those are systemic questions, right? So are we actually going to have, if the electric light was invented today, would we just still get home at 5 p.m. and then have time to pursue hobbies in the evening? Or would we just be forced by employers to work an extra 6 hours for the same pay?
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess I have two more questions. I guess the before we wind this up, one is a question about a duration mismatch. Sometimes I feel like the one of the challenges that that startups face is the need to show sort of short term, results and effects, and that prevents them from thinking through a lot of the kinds of things that we're talking about. And it also prevents investors, politicians, this sort of short termism. A lot of people think or believe that that's actually been driven by technology and by the internet, by media cycles. So on one hand you have this like shortening of horizons. We need results faster, quicker, more immediately. And on the other hand, I feel like you have this conscious longer term, longer horizon. How do we sort that mismatch out?
Well, I would describe the mismatch the other way around, because I've never met firms that are more long term than startups.
Yeah,
I've met a couple of family owned businesses where they think in terms of generations, but startups are long term because you're worth
yeah.
nothing in the next 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. It's a 5 years
Mhm.
on that you are you are worth something. And
Yeah.
what was fascinating when COVID struck was how many startups started saying, well, we've only got 18 months of working capital because we don't have any revenues. And of course, there are very few operating businesses in the world that have 18 months of working capitals if you pull their revenues down to zero.
Yeah.
Right, because you chuck this back out to the managers or to the PE firm or share buybacks, and so on. So the
Yeah.
duration mismatch, I think that I see somewhat is there are a few. One is that startups take time to scale. In climate tech, in particular, that scaling is much longer than with software for many
Yeah.
many obvious and less obvious reasons, but basically to do with the fact that it's physical stuff in the physical world, and
Yeah.
people care about that more. And so that's one duration mismatch. A second is the access they have to the capital that is required at that point because of the 10-year fund, which is
Yeah.
barely long enough to fund a software business, let alone a clean tech, a climate tech business.
Yeah.
So they're having to be quite creative there. And then there's the mismatch between with large firms and their understanding about what their purpose is. So if you look at car companies, with the exception of the Chinese and Tesla, they fundamentally, or rather deliberately, misunderstood the duration of the electric vehicle transition, because it was too hard, I think, for them to acknowledge and accept that this thing might happen in 6 years, not 26 years.
Yeah.
And there are going to be a number of industries that face those types of challenges because consumer or customer demand is going to change fundamentally, right? And a large part of this will be saying, actually, we're gonna find greener ways to do this, so we can bootstrap existing infrastructure. And so you'll get hyper efficient electrolyzers. Electric hydrogen, for example, just closed a $350 million Series C a few days ago, that can produce hydrogen without having to use methane and so on. And that can be plugged into existing industrial processes. Or you'll say, well, let's build synthetic e-fuels that we can just, LanzaJet style, stick into existing aircraft. And that also makes a case. But there is still also a duration mismatch between managers of companies who are on the old paradigm, for whom it's in their interest and their fiduciary duty to slow the transition to the new paradigm. And I think about what the BMW CEO has said in the last couple of weeks or months about, Europe won't be making cars unless we slow down EV adoption. Those types of comments. Well, the issue is we actually just need the EV adoption to happen much faster, and maybe BMW should have just, once it had its success with the i3 and the i8 10 years ago, should have bitten the bullet and transitioned faster.
Yeah.
And there, to me, is where we have this kind of timing mismatch as well. And that's really hard because, as Michael Liebreich sort of says to me, business cycle is 5 years, so 10 years away is only 2 business cycles. Right? It's not long.
Terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael Liebreich was actually on this podcast as well. So you're in very
Well,
good company.
just a note to listeners then, if you haven't heard Zoe and Michael Liebreich, he's so brilliant. You should, after this, go off and listen to that.
Very definitely. Okay, I have one final comment, which is I noticed that you have kids, and obviously there's been a lot of talk about the sort of education in the future. And you mentioned that you got your first computer at the age of 9. I got my first computer at the age of 11. My parents told me I could have one if I built it, which obviously, in the sort of early 90s was a lot easier to do than it is today, paradoxically. What is your attitude towards, sort of, do you give your kids free range on, with AI? Do you, are you trying to shield them like some of the tech, tycoons are saying they're not going to give their kids, any tech?
Well, I think that's two different things. So we were not brilliant around the sort of iPad world because it was hard.
Yeah,
But there's a lot more nuance in all of those issues.
absolutely. Yeah.
And that nuance. I mean, if you look at the American Psychological Association's review of social media and teens,
Mhm.
it is that for many, many, many teens, use of social media is incredibly valuable. It helps develop their social brain, and they
Yeah.
get angry about being told to turn it off because they're actually doing something that is the same as us meeting with friends and having a constructive conversation, and that where the risks start to emerge when there are other aspects of someone's profile that are at risk, right?
Mhm.
Which you can't control solely through the device.
Yeah.
When I think about AI, my kids have got different approaches to them. One is sort of understands it. I mean, they can all talk about it, of course, but isn't that particularly interested in using it. The other two will use those tools. One of them just did A levels and was revising for them, and actually established their own way of working with ChatGPT, which was to do the answer to the question that they were doing, the essay question, and then get ChatGPT to critique their answer and look at the critique and then see whether they agreed with the recommendations. And that happened to work for them and for the way in which their brain works and how they
Mhm.
wanted to use the tools. So
Yeah.
I think that if you are using ChatGPT the way Homer Simpson would, which is getting ChatGPT to do it for you,
Yeah.
I mean, you'll get as far as you get. But on the other hand, it is just because you use paintbrushes rather than daubing the canvas with your fingers doesn't make you a less skilled painter.
Interesting. So it's a tool rather than, a sort of end in itself.
Well, I think for some people it could be used as an end in itself,
Yeah.
and we are lucky or my kids are maybe they're unlucky, but at least from my perspective, we're able to prompt them to use these things in a hopefully a more sensible way.
Fascinating. Well, thank you. I apologize. I've gone over time a little bit, but the conversation was just so interesting. I couldn't wrap it up. Couldn't bring myself to wrap it up earlier. But thank you so much for the conversation. Absolutely fascinating insights, and I would love to meet you at some point to continue delving into these kinds of things further. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today.
Really, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Talks podcast. To find out more or join as a guest, head over to the ETF Partners website at etfpartners.capital. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Medium at ETF Partners. Until next time, thanks for listening.